the chat and telling us where you're joining us from, that would be great. After the initial talk with Kija, we'll open it up for Q&A. So Kija and I will talk and we'll see some of her work for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions for about 20 at the end. So drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this series or any of MoAD's programming, please consider donating to MoAD online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. The link to where you can donate will be in the chat, or you can also give by cell by texting the word MoAD SF, that's MoAD SF, to the number 56512 on your cell phone. Then follow the link provided to make a donation. All donations will go towards supporting MoAD and continuing to bring you engaging programming like this one. So I also want to take a moment to do a brief land acknowledgement before we begin. I know that we're all joining from all over different parts of the Bay, different parts of the world, but it's important that we continue to make this a practice in our programming. So as many of us are settler, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MoAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to the artist for the artist studio visit today, Kija Lucas. Kija is an artist and educator based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She uses photography to explore ideas of home, heritage, and inheritance. She's interested in how ideas are passed down and seemingly inconsequential moments create changes that last generations. Lucas has shown her work throughout the Bay Area and nationally, including MoAD, Anglim Gilbert Gallery, Montalvo Arts Center, and the Headlands Center for the Arts. She is a member of 3.9 Art Collective and the Curatorial Council at Southern Exposure. Lucas received her BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and her MFA from Mills College. Yay, Kija. How are you? How are you today?
You know, it's funny, I haven't really known how to answer that question for a while. I've just sort of...
Yes, it's a very loaded question, and it has been for weeks.
Like, I have a warm place to sleep and I have enough food to eat, and so that's good. But it's been a difficult question to answer, definitely. How about you?
I am acutely, yes, I am also very aware of, I'm not sure how to answer that question whenever I'm asked it. And I feel like I think the sentiment doesn't change, and that like I am not in imminent, nothing is immediately wrong, but everything is wrong. So, it's just kind of a roller coaster of emotions and all the time, pretty much. So, but I like to start out still in like asking how people are, just kind of to take a pulse of how we're all like living through what's happening right now, and not even as we're doing this, as we're having the studio visit, as we're moving on with work and with art and with programming, being very like distinctly aware that we're all deeply affected as human beings, and that's just as important, perhaps most important, actually, to this whole conversation. So
yeah, definitely.
So where are you right now?
I am in my live work space in San Francisco. I just moved here a few months ago, so it's not fully set up, but I've had a little time to learn about nesting since I moved in an early.
A lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sitting at my dining table, which is where I spend a lot of time right now, writing letters, and also I've taken up just drawing the things that are around me in my life, and I don't normally have a drawing practice, but that's been something that's been sort of good for me lately. Yeah.
Can we take a little tour of your space? I see behind you, obviously, plants and books and everything, but it'd be nice to kind of see.
Of course. So I have, this is where I sit. I have this beautiful Mildred Howard print above my drawing table. And then, sorry, that was unnecessary. There's a little Mariah Carey with a cat that says everything's gonna be awesome that came from my former coworker. You can see my plants and books and where I sleep. And then I'm gonna try to keep the computer this way because there's a mess on the other side of the room. And then coming into my studio, which is also quite a mess. I have storage upstairs, and then here's my workspace. I decided to move my workspace onto this side of my place because you can work in the dark when you're working on the computer. And then I have a scanner, which is, oops, let me just point this down so you can see it, which is part of how I make my work next to my computer. And flat files and a printer to print on. And I don't have any work on the walls yet of my own, partially because I just moved here and haven't been printing yet. So I'll be putting some work in the on the walls in the studio soon. So sorry that they're not up now for you guys to see. Sweet.
How is working? I mean, obviously you're in a live workspace anyway, so a lot of, your practice was going to be in this space, but how are you finding being in shelter in place and being in quarantine affecting the way you work and the way you are in your space?
So it was really in the beginning of shelter in place, my studio was not moved in and I didn't have anything to make work. And to be honest, I've been like pretty overwhelmed and it's been difficult to like sort of dive back into my regular work practice, but I do have some deadlines looming. So I will be getting back into it because I'm one of those people who, I make work for myself, but then also like when there are deadlines looming, then I will just be like, okay, time to snap out of it. You have to get back to work. But I did start a new project since shelter in place in collaboration with Layla Weaver that's called the Forgiveness Project, where we're writing letters about forgiveness and asking people to write them back to us as well.
How did that project start?
It started, so Layla and I are good friends and we talk a lot, and we were just sort of talking about like this sort of understanding where certain things stem from. And so like if like my letter of forgiveness is to my father for not trying harder to live. And I think like we were just talking about like, oh well, this person, once you realize that your parent had all of these things generations back that were pushing on to their life and like affecting who they were, you start to realize, oh, like all of the things that I was holding them accountable for, there are also people in the world that like had difficult lives as well. So I think we were talking at first about my grandmother whose mom got cellulitis while she was giving birth and wasn't able to hold my grandmother for the first 3 weeks of her life. And my grandmother had written in this article about violence against women, how that was like one of the first like violent acts she felt like she had happened with her, was like not being held by her mother for those early weeks of her life. And Layla and I were sort of talking about that and like forgiving ourselves for things. And so we were planning to write letters to each other about this thing. And then we decided to invite other people into the process because we're trying to make space for compassion and self-care in this time. And there's so many things, I don't know, I hold on to so much anger and like all this stuff that's like inside of me where I feel like I need to let go of this in order to have more compassion for myself and others, especially stuff that's not serving me any longer. So yeah.
And this project was started during shelter in place, during quarantine. How
Definitely.
is it? But how is the last few weeks also kind of affected where the project is or where it's going? I feel like forgiveness is always a part of the conversation, but in different ways. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking about care and forgiveness at this time where so much there is so much anger, there is so much and righteous anger and righteous frustration, but there's also this space for or is there this space for forgiveness? How does this work how does this project work with kind of within the last few weeks?
Yeah, it's interesting. We got a request to do like a workshop last week, and we just said this week is for mourning and for righteous anger, and we'll come back to forgiveness later.
Yeah.
I do think forgiveness is really like helpful for the person who's holding on to something sometimes. I also think that there is a place for righteous anger, and there is a place for saying like, actually, I cannot forgive that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But for the things that I feel like the forgiveness is for the parts that's damaging us to hold on to, you know? So yeah, I don't know. Like I sort of have put down my pen and stopped I've been rewriting this same letter, and I've sort of put down my pen and not really done much with it in the last couple of weeks. And I feel like that's okay. I'm just sort of like trying to like, and like to me, like part of the forgiveness project is like forgiving my father who, like we had to be worried when we were all in the car with him and we got pulled over by the police, so like understanding like how he lived his life and how the environment around him affected him is also like a big part of this for me,
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling about it, but yeah. I think the other thing to say too is Layla and I, neither of us are well, she's a lot more of a writer than I am, but neither of us are like experts in forgiveness or experts in writing letters, but it's just a practice that we decided like was important too. And so we started
Yeah.
and I would say that it's been very helpful yeah, I'm really glad to have such like a brilliant collaborator on this project.
Yeah. So in getting back to, because you're mentioning that writing hasn't necessarily been a foundational part of your practice or it hasn't been a big part of your practice up until this point, up until this project. How do you see this project as informing or intersecting with your photographic practice?
It's interesting because like I try not to see like the end product of it, but at the same time I'm like, I want to photograph all the letters that we get and put them together in a way like in a book or something of the sort. I feel like conceptually and like in my heart they belong together, maybe not visually using the same thing, but like sort of they're using the same ideas. So I'm really not sure. It's so new, so I'm not sure how. It's also like I haven't really collaborated with anyone before. I feel like I'm very much like, other than like social practice in my photography, working with the public, but otherwise I haven't really, or my grandmother who's like an unwitting collaborator in one of my projects, but I haven't had like somebody who I was like, okay, like
what project is that?
About this,
Which project is the one with your
it's called Collections from Sundown, and it's
yeah,
grandmother's letters and objects that she would collect. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that series?
I didn't send you images from
You didn't
that.
send me images of that one, but I can pull it up from your website though, and then share my screen. If you wanted,
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Talk about it now. It does have to do with letters. My grandmother had Alzheimer's for 11 years, but she was diagnosed 11 years before she passed away. And she had something that's called sundowner syndrome. So that's something with people who have dementia or Alzheimer's they'll believe that they're going somewhere, or they need to pack their things, and it happens most in the evening and in the winter time. And so early on in her, she had Alzheimer's, she would pack bags. And so I would ask my mother, who was her main caregiver, can you photograph with your phone, like what she packed? And I would go back and make still lives of this. And then after a few years, she stopped packing because she had a caregiver sort of around the clock. And so I took these letters that I had collected over the years that she had written, notes that she wrote about like where she was going, or like trying to remind herself of something, or asking my mother a question. And I would photograph them. This is an image of an exhibition of the work. So those are individual letters kind of grouped together, like the groupings. And I feel like there's repetition in it, like redundancy throughout the letters, or the notes, but also in the way that they're photographed and grouped together. The same note might appear more than once. And it's sort of, to me, like trying to convey the way that it feels when you're communicating with somebody who has Alzheimer's or dementia. Yeah.
I think something that's interesting too, about the series, one of the things that struck me initially is the title of it, and I guess this idea of sundowner syndrome, and thinking about sundown, like what I associate with sundowns is sundown towns, and this idea that like that dusk means there's a different level of awareness of heightened anxiety and fear, obviously around, spaces where Black people could not be after a certain hour of day, but just the concept of sundown as being this space of heightened kind of anxiety, but also this space of possibility as well. And I think, I don't know if you see that as being part of this series also, potentially.
Yeah, I think so. I think I chose the title collections from Sundown because Sundown has so many meanings behind it.
Some of the
It's also like when people think about like the sundown of life as well, So when I was thinking about it, it was more to do with those things than sundown towns, which obviously I'm also like aware of, and the ways that there is this transition and in our minds and the way that we see the world at dusk and at that time where even when you're traveling, like if you're driving, it's like sort of hardest to see when everything sort of becomes flat like that,
Yeah. I think this series also, so Sundown Towns also as a concept in Sundown, seems to, in its like historical precedence, also seems to connect really heavily with some of the other themes of your work, and looking at how these objects kind of are, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. These objects that you find or collect or are brought create this sense of place, and thinking about place and thinking about memory. So I want to talk a little bit about the objects to remember you by, and the Museum of Sentimental Taxonomy that you've been working on. I know that just before Shelter in Place, you were doing a residency at Montalvo Arts Center. And do you want to talk a little bit about what you were working on there, specifically, and yeah.
Yeah, so at the same time that I started working on collections from Sundown, I started working on Objects to Remember You by an Index of Sentiment, which is now the Museum of Sentimental Taxonomy. So I've been photographing other people's sentimental objects since 2014 and collecting the stories along with them. I try to be as broad as possible when I ask them to bring objects of sentimental value, and I like the way that people choose how they want to be represented by this object that they're bringing in. I really at Montalvo, I had an exhibition of the work, and then I was also able to photograph objects inside the space of the museum, which I really like to be able to do, where people can come in and see what other people's objects are while they're having their own photograph. And then I arranged them onto, this was in a vitrine that's 36 by 70 or something, 32 by 70, something like that. All of the objects sort of together in a vitrine or in a frame, sort similar to the way that it would be seen in a museum, but like tighter together. I started liking that like sort of overwhelming amount of stuff together over time.
Is this all one person's?
Oh no, these are different people's objects put together. And so it began sort of like trying to do it in order of when they were photographed or something, but some objects I photographed front facing and some from above. And so it started turning in the vitrines. It was more like, how can I fit these things together? So yeah, I photographed objects from probably around 500 or so people in different spaces, Wasaic, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Grinnell, Iowa, Tulsa, Oklahoma, all over the Bay Area, and sort of just go in and set up a space and invite people to come in with my camera and a backdrop and 2 lights, and photograph their object and have a conversation with them about the object and the meaning that it has in their life.
Did you notice any interesting similarities or interesting differences between the objects that were brought in from one place or another? Like, how were the people's objects from Mosaic potentially different from the objects you were seeing in the Bay Area? Or was there this striking, like, everybody brings in grandma spoon, you know, like, was there like these like,
there is quite a bit of like a ring or something like that. There's a lot of, that's one of the reasons why I like try not to have too much instruction, because then like people can see the variety of stuff on the website and then sort of be like, oh, it could be anything. You know, I expected there to be more like things in different places. There's probably a lot more. It also depends on the space that I was in and like the people that were invited there by the like through social media, etc. These are mostly from the Bay, but there's a few that are, well, the top left-hand corner is from Grinnell.
Yeah, I see the MTA card sticking out of.
Oh yeah, that was actually a young man in Oakland who he said like he read the book and the biography of Malcolm X, and it like changed his life and the way that he interacts with the world, etc. And that was his bookmark that he was holding in there. So yeah, and also like I believe he was talking to me about a trip to New York as well. So like those things sort of went together.
So these objects kind of create these makeshift portraits also of the people who are bringing them in, of their owners. What has been your decision to photograph the objects on their own and in community with other objects, as opposed to making portraits of, say, people, like approaching it as like a still life project almost, as opposed to a portrait?
So I believe that when people like, there's this thing that happens in photography where people believe that you can capture the essence of the subject in an image. And maybe I believe that's bullshit, or maybe I just believe that I can't do that. I believe that a portrait that is someone's face is a collaboration between the photographer, the subject, and the viewer. So if you see an image of me, you're going to make a judgment on me of like what you think that somebody who looks like me, like somebody who's making this face that I'm making that looks like me, somebody who wears the clothes that I'm wearing, etc. And so rather than that, I say, like, how are you going to represent yourself here? And I do think of it as a portrait of the person. I'm also very interested in the ways that museums collect objects and put them together as a representation of, like, I also think that's another way that's kind of bullshit. Also, like, just like you walk into a room at certain museums and it's like, ooh, this doesn't belong here. Like, why do you have this? And this is a way to me for people to represent how they want to be represented, and also for them to tell the story behind how they're represented. So on the website, and also like if someone comes to see the show and I'm there, I'll tell them the stories with the work. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I think there's something obvious in multiple series of yours about objecthood and about the kind of objects as these totems, these indication, having these relationships with their owners, with the people who keep them, who collect them, who give them value, and what their like afterlife is. And I think that's something that photographs also act as those sorts of objects. And so it seemed really interesting that you were basically making objects out of objects in this very endless indexical kind of way. And I think something that I'm really curious about too, and that I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on, is thinking about the archive and the idea of archiving, because so many of these projects feel like archives of a time, of a place, of a person, and thinking about how archives have been used historically in taxonomy, in these ways of colonial categorization and division, in a sense of how do we parse out this thing from this thing from this thing to analyze it or to impose a certain kind of order. But then archives are also these really deeply emotional, effectual places where we store our memories, and we store our feelings, and we store our hopes and our emotions. And I don't know, just can you talk a little bit? That's something that struck me. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that tension in sort of the archive as a space, or and how that work functions in your work.
Yeah, so a couple things, or a few things. I was in a studio visit once and somebody said to me, like, wow, you really like to have control in your work. And I was like, I don't really think so. I kind of feel like I'm constantly like trying to like, maybe it's like an imposter syndrome or something like that, where I'm like, I try to like seem organized, or like I have that, but I really feel like it's not under my control as much, especially with this work. I'm not telling people what to bring. But I didn't, and also I didn't know that I didn't even think of my work as an archive until I was invited to be in a exhibition about the archive. And then I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's what I'm
doing.
But I always noticed how I've never like felt in place anywhere, but people have tried to place me in places. And I think that happens with all of us, where there's like this categorization that happens that is made up. And so with this work, and with the work that I made for In Search of Home and the stuff with my grandmother, it's more like trying to show that attempt at categorization, that it's actually impossible. Like those things they're created for someone's system of things. So when people say like, oh, did you put like certain things with other things? Like, I'm trying to like, obviously I'm a human being and like I have my own biases. And so I might actually not put something next to another thing, because I'm like, am I trying to say something with this or not? I also think photography is an excellent place to lie. And so I have this like sort of trope of scientific imagery here that I'm using. But then if you look at the actual image printed, like I don't measure anything when I photograph it. So I try to guess at the right size. And I will reprint if it's a comically large or comically small version of the thing. Like I'm like, that doesn't work. But sometimes things people will be like, oh, this looks a little bit smaller, a little bit big. And I think that's where I sort of draw people out of the assumption that this is like some sort of scientific reality or that there's a necessary truth to the way that things are put together. And I think with all my work, I try to do that because it's trying to talk about that categorization or that like way that the archive works, and use the same visual ideas, but then sort of making it in a way that pulls you out of believing that that thing is true, I guess.
Yeah. Can we I feel like that's a good pivot for thinking about some of these work
Yeah.
that you've done. And so I want to begin by first because these are works that are done with a scanner, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So and when did you start using the scanner in your work, and what kind of led you to start thinking about that as a cameraless, ultimately a cameraless photographic process?
Yeah, so this is the first body of work in Search of Home that I used a scanner with. And it started off, I had a scanner in my old studio and I put something that I had on there and I said, like, oh, I'm going to just see how this works. And I thought, wow, this is like so beautiful that it made the image, how it made the image of this thing. And it was a natural object as well. And then I was trying to think of like how I wanted to make work about botanicals. And I was trying to think about how to do that in a way that was like authentic to my own practice. Because at first I thought, this is going around in circles, but at first I was thinking about making images of poisonous plants from art historical or literature, because I felt like I was like nobody. It was right after grad school, and like there was like a radio silence around my work, and I was like, maybe I need to make these like references to like art history or something like that. But it was like not interesting to me at all. But like with this work, I thought about the work of Anna Atkins, like with the cyanotypes of botanicals that she was making. And my dad was a gardener, so like when I was a kid, like we had to have our hands in the dirt a lot to help him at work. And these images were also like I thought, okay, well, Anna Atkins used the cyanotype, which was a direct to print process, but this is a contemporary way of doing that. It was the first photographic book, and she also used the like the scientific taxonomic names that from Carl Linnaeus, whose work this is had sort of jumping off sort of his mid 1700s like invention of race, and how that has affected like my ancestors, etc. So that was why the scanner, mostly because it was beautiful and I liked the way that it looked in the images. And then I was like, oh, but this is like a tool that can really talk to photo history and talk to the other stuff. And it was like really when I started being like, oh, this is like using these, like again, like the tropes of like scientific imagery, like this illusion of perfection. But then I was taking things that were not perfect, you know?
Yeah. I mean, obviously these works are the depth of clarity on them is so great. They're so visually arresting and stunning. But then I think it's also your mind starts to try to work out how it happens, how this even is possible. And I think there's like a sense of wonder as well. I liked what you said earlier about photography being, or, this being a good place to lie,
Mhm.
photography being like a great place to lie essentially. And I think there's so much duality in a lot of what you do, and I think lying is both initially possibly seems like a very obviously sneaky, calculated thing, but there's also a way in which there's a magic to it as well, and I think you get that sense in the work.
Yeah, I feel like there's something to me about a photograph that I make having to be beautiful as well as interesting. Like I'm not interested in one without the other. But like when I did put something on the scanner for the first time, I was like, whoa. And also, I like the way that the digital artifacting happens. Like you can't see it well in any of these images, but like I was bringing these botanicals into, like I went on a road trip to make a lot of this work, or a couple road trips, and I was bringing these botanical clippings into a place where I was sleeping. And so that was my studio, like just the scanner in a suitcase in my trunk that I would bring with me, and like just bring the objects inside. And so over time they just like sorry um over time I just began to I just totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. um yeah but the way that like I didn't know as much, again, like when people ask me about like why don't they have the names of the Latin names of the plants, um or like assume that I know a lot about plants,
Mhm.
which I don't actually. I would get nervous. Like I would bring this into the place I was sleeping, and then I would be like I got an allergic reaction to ragweed that was like really beautiful in the photograph, but I shouldn't have slept with it in the room with me. And then I would be
Yeah.
like, am I gonna poison myself? And then also, if there were bugs on it,
Mhm.
it would like move through and create this sort of like RGB rainbow situation and the motion. The objects like this brick, like being really careful and actually putting like some sort of acetate under it. This is the only thing that I did that with. But then bringing in those things that are not actually botanicals sort of like push the work to the next level for me. Sorry, I lost my train of thought and then I just kept.
No, it's okay. Um, I want to talk a little bit about, because I think a little bit about history. You're obviously talking about having, developing a lot of this form, basically thinking about these art historical precedents and thinking about the scientific precedents. And how do you think, I guess, like how do you see objects as being, like objects obviously are little indexes of time and space and place in very specific ways. So I was just wondering, I guess, how this is a very roundabout question that's basically like how do you see what's happening, now basically, and what your practice has been historically, with these objects. Like do you see another series in which these works will, like objects from this time period will start to inform like a new body of work as a means of creating or documenting this like contemporary history, this like living history that we're in kind of now.
Well, it's interesting because I believe that history is like, I don't think of history as like a linear thing. I think of it as like this type of thing where it's history now is like stacked on top of the history from the past. Like we're building on top of that, sort of like an ancient city is built on top of another ancient city. And so I kind of feel like there's like maybe some building on top of it. Um, I guess I don't know if that's the, yeah, I just feel like it's sort of we're stacking on top of what has happened in the past. And so there might be new work that comes out of this. I'm not sure. But I also think that like when I'm looking at this stuff and talking about the historical context, it's really to talk about where we are now,
Hmm.
and how we got here and how science has like pseudosciences from hundreds of years ago have added on to our situation that we're in right now, and how we have to look at those things in order to understand the way that we see one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it definitely does. I want to open it up to questions. I know we have a couple already in the Q&A box, because I really want this to be a robust discussion. So I'm going to start with the first question is from, well, yeah, I'll read the names of people, presumably if they would like them to be read. So the first question comes from Rula. Thanks for offering this event, Kija and Elena. Kija, I'm wondering if you could speak about self-care as you work with and photograph other people's sentimental objects. Do you feel yourself taking on that emotional weight of the objects and the interactions? If so, like, how do you reconcile that?
That's a really interesting question, and something that I didn't expect to happen when I started.
Do you know Rihanna tell a story?
It is
her whole story.
Times where I'll schedule an entire day to be in a space, or sometimes a week where I'll sit in a space and sit with people and listen to their stories, and it can often be heavy, and I want to leave space for them. I want to be as open as possible and let them share with me as much as possible while I'm photographing their objects, and sometimes before and after. And I remember doing a residency at the DeYoung Museum where I was there for a month doing this 5 days a week, and I would leave just like I was exhausted, and I wouldn't want to talk to anyone afterwards, and I would need to go to sleep at like 8 o'clock. And I was like, oh, this is something that I need to like pay attention to and like take care of myself. So I try to leave that space open while I'm in the studio or in the space with a person, for them to be able to be as open as possible with me, and make it a safe space for them. And then when I leave, like, I think like going through editing the photos, then I return to that. Self-care to me is like, used to be lifting weights, which doesn't happen right now with shelter in place. There's no going to the gym.
You don't have like a weight kit just like in your apartment?
I have like a few dumbbells that my brother gave me and a kettlebell, but that doesn't happen as much. But I do need to give myself space to like sort of like let the stuff go through me. And like I said, I think it's a huge important part of the process to like be there with the person while I'm photographing the object. But all of my work is pretty heavy. I think like while making it, I have to create a boundary for my own self in it. I had a studio visit once where somebody was like, how is this not, like, how are you talking about this so level-headedly? And I was like, well, do you want me to cry in front of you? I'm not sure. Like, I have to figure out a way to like sort of like, I put myself into it, and then I figure out how to talk about it without like having to feel all those emotions every single time, because it would be too much, I think. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think like it can be a lot, and I, like exercise and just mental health care. My Lexapro is very helpful with it too. Like just doing the things that I can to like make sure that I'm physically and mentally healthy in order to be able to make the work. Yeah.
I think so. That question leads into the next question, I think, in a really interesting way. So the next question is from Manoush, and they ask, how do you curate the objects? Which you talked a little bit about, but if you want to revisit.
Yeah. So in the beginning, like I said, I tried to make everything sort of chronological. Some people will bring in one object and some will bring in like 35 objects. And so if someone brings in a lot of stuff, I usually choose certain ones, but all of the different objects will go on the website. But I try to represent just about everybody when I exhibit the work if possible. So in the beginning was more chronological, and then sometimes I just need to figure out where things fit. And like, it's all one category of things that are sentimentally valuable to people. So like, even if it's like certain kinds of objects, I think of it as like, these are all things that are sentimentally valuable. So I can go through and say like, I really want a big thing here, and this is how I'm going to balance it. So a lot of it is visual, and then also somewhat chronological.
I think it's interesting. I like those two questions paired together because it reminded me of how I was at a talk back when talks used to happen in person. I don't remember which one. It was a while ago. But that was reminding the audience that, you know, curation comes from like curare, the Latin, I believe, that basically means to care. And like how like a curator's job is ultimately to care for objects, to care for the work, to care, and ultimately you can extrapolate to like care for audiences and for the, you know, the museums or the gallery, whatever you're curating for. And so I think there's something really interesting and important about this idea that you are caring for these people's, you're not just caring for their objects in and placing them in the sense of getting, you know, of getting the image, but you're also kind of caring for them through this process a little bit as well. And also how their contribution to your project is another way that you are caring for yourself. You know, I was just thinking about you talking about how you're moving through these things, like forgiveness and your relationship with your family, your relationship with, you know, like generational or ancestral even reckonings with like ancestral trauma or whatever. You know, like there's a level of care that is a through line of care in all aspects of your work, which I think is really great. It's one of the things I really like about your work.
Thank you. I'm glad that you see that. I don't always know what is seen through, so but I feel that as well. And I feel like another thing in that way is the stories that I have, like kind of a really good memory, at least right now. And so like I feel like that's one of my favorite things is like when someone comes to see the work is like going through and telling them stories about the different objects, like the things that people have told me about them, the experience I had when photographing it as well. I'm hoping for the next exhibit of this work that I can make like an audio tour and talk about like 50 different objects that people can see while they're going through it. But I think that's part of that care as well.
Yeah. So the next isn't so much a question. It's but it's anonymous attendee wanted to share. In Search of Home was one of the more popular pieces among middle school students visiting the museum. The kids were drawn, because Kija, and for those of you who may not be aware, Kija Lucas was one of the artists who was in one of the last exhibitions we had at MoAD before Shelter in Place, Don't Shoot, an opus of the opulence of Blackness, which was curated by Melanie and Melora Green. And yeah, two of the works from that series were in that exhibition. And so this says, the kids were drawn to the earth, the ground. I was pleased to see children today still feel connected to the earth.
Yeah.
Is that yeah.
Sorry, what were you doing?
I was just gonna say, is that relationship to like the ground and to the earth something that you are intentionally, you know, kind of intentionally exploring? Because there does seem to be a relation, like especially in that one image, and I can show it again, of the big clump that was the one that was in the show, that big clump of dirt, and there are these like little particles that all kind of exist around it. It feels like really affecting in terms of thinking about the earth and the cosmos at the same time and feeling really grounded. Yeah,
that was the first image in that series that, you know, like I raised a bunch of money and then like did a 5,000-mile road trip on my own. I was 2 weeks into the road trip when I made that image. And I was in my head questioning myself, like, is this work interesting to anyone outside of my own head?
yeah.
And I was in Bristol, Virginia, which is on the border of Tennessee, and I was on the land that was historically a plantation where my ancestors were enslaved when I found that clump of dirt. And to me, I had gone there, and there were other people around, and I asked if I could go later. And I was really like kind of feeling defeated, and the sun shone through a cloud onto that clump of dirt that was from like the foundation beneath this house that was being restored. And it was almost like the sun coming through the cloud, like singing like, ah. And I saw it, and I just walked over and I was like, that's my fucking dirt. That dirt has my DNA in it. Like that has my ancestors' like sweat and blood in it. And so yes, like thinking about how we are connected to one another and to the earth and to all of that stuff. And also it was the first image that I felt comfortable and safe moving outside of that like very structured, clean way of making these images. Like it was the first time I said, oh, if I let stuff fall where it is, it's more visually dynamic, but also more interesting because it's breaking down that like idea of perfection, that idea of like, this is exactly how this thing should be seen. So to me, yeah, and I love that it feels like it's, you know, part of space or floating in space. And you can't really tell what size it is in life or whatever. But yeah, that connectedness and like just being able to feel connected to my ancestors through this like dirt, through getting my hands dirty, through, you know, the botanicals that are growing out of those spaces, I feel like was very important. And I think for kids to be able to connect with that and feel something from it is like really great to me. Like I want my work to be something that's accessible to people with all experiences of art, where they could walk in and see it and like get it from their level and then learn more about it if they want to. So anyways, yeah.
Okay, so the last question in here is, or it's another comment. I'd love to see your work in more detail up close. I'm particularly interested in the botanicals and the Sundown series, the latter because I'm now decoding expressions from a person with dementia. Yeah, when so in the presentation that we of your work that we saw in the images from your website of in the gallery space, they're kind of in these they're framed glass. How is that the only way you've presented that work?
Yeah, that's the only way I've presented it. The only that was the only full exhibition that I've had of it too. It's going up in Ithaca. Well, it's all in Ithaca and going up in October now. But yeah, that's the only way that I've presented that work thus far. If you, yeah, and the, I don't know. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought.
It wasn't so much a question, yeah. I guess. Yeah, just
yeah, that's how the work is seen. If whoever said that, if you ever actually want to see it up close, just email me for a studio visit. I'm happy to show it to you. I'm really interested in like also the decoding of expressions of somebody with dementia. That sounds really interesting.
I have a kind of final-ish question, just in thinking about how all of these objects come together and how they come to you through other people, through people bringing them to spaces, to you being in spaces. And I think hopefully you can see where I'm going with this now. How do you think about your work, I guess, now in what will ultimately be a post kind of COVID world in terms of how we're actually even allowed to be in space with one another? And now that touch and the idea of touch and transmission through contact is so much more loaded than it already kind of was. How do you think you're going to like navigate that, I guess, in continuing any of this work?
This is something that actually somebody brought up in conversation the other day with me, like, what is artwork going to look like anymore? So I'm thinking a lot about this because the work for the Museum of Sentimental Taxonomy is moving to CIIS this summer, and it will be on view. There will not be an opening reception. I'm hoping that they'll allow me to be in the space, masked and gloved, to photograph artwork. But it does make for or to photograph objects, and it does make for another experience. And I've really thought a lot about this because there's possibility that it will be a very long time till we can be in a space together. And I haven't figured that out yet. But I am hoping that like the protections that we have with a mask and gloves on will still allow for that same intimacy of conversation with somebody who brings in an object. I've thought about like, how do you, like, would I want to have people photograph their own objects, but I feel like being in space with them is like a huge part of making the work. So yeah, I'm not sure yet. I think a lot about this, and I think a lot of artists are worried about it. And I'll say also, as like a single person who lives alone, like when you said like, yeah, when touch is more, and I'm just like, it's been so long since I loved anyone.
Dude, I know, I feel you.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of it is very, everything is just very charged, I would say, right now.
Exactly.
Things that we used to take for granted.
Yeah. I don't know.
So yeah, so we're coming up on the last couple minutes. There's one other, not a question, another comment in the chat or in the Q&A that says, from Jennifer N, that says, I've always enjoyed your work. There's always a stillness. This is a thread that I've seen run through the years. It's beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you.
So yeah. If there are no more questions, I guess I'm going to thank you, Kija, for being in conversation with me today. I think it's been really exciting to see your work develop, just to see your work in person and be able to kind of think about your practice a little bit. And it's been really interesting to hear about the Forgiveness Project, especially right now. I think it is a very timely and cathartic kind of piece of art making that I'm excited to see kind of how that continues as well. Yeah, thank you to everyone who watched this incredible In the Artist Studio. I don't know if you want to drop in, I can drop your website in the chat in case people want to like check up on your work later.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been really great, and it's always really nice talking to you, and you're always so insightful, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great. I had a really good time. I really enjoy your work, just personally, as well as an official MoADian. But yeah, even just as a person, I really enjoy you and your work a lot. So this has been great.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the work you guys are doing over there.
Yeah. You can, it says you can find a recording of this program on MoAD's YouTube channel. So
awesome.
Tell your friends, and you can watch this again later as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elena.
Yeah, thank you, Kija, and thank you to everyone who is watching.